So in preparing this talk for today, I was trying to pay attention to Yokwei's initial request, which was in the first year, there's taking a look at cybernetics for the 21st century and looking backwards. And in this second round of talks, it's on taking a look at cybernetics in the 21st century, looking forward. And so I'd like to address that specifically. But given that there's so many different interpretations about the context, that is, what is the 21st century? And second of all, even more differences of opinion and views about cybernetics, I think it's important to sort of bound and frame the context for this discussion and then zero in on the key points that I think are really important. So the most important place I'd start is that we're living in a profoundly evolving global context. There's been a lot of attention given to lots of different names for what the 21st century is like. And some people talk about the global problematique, and some people talk about a polycrisis. But a term that I find the most appropriate is the Anthropocene, in part because it emphasizes the impact of humanity, not only on other human beings and other living systems, but the planet as a whole. But it's also an all-inclusive term that goes beyond what the geologists are saying. It's not just moving from the Holocene to the Anthropocene, but it's actually a whole set of new existential challenges that, at least from what I've been seeing and considering, are jeopardizing the habitability of planet Earth. And when I say that, I'm talking about the habitability of planet Earth for human beings primarily, but also other forms of life that might be broadly defined as Gaia. So it's not just about what's in it for the humanity, it's also in it for other species on the planet. I don't think there's any problems for the planet as a whole, but I do think it's going to be increasingly difficult for many of us to be able to live the way we've been living and would like to be living, not only ourselves, but also our children and our grandchildren. So one of the key questions in framing the context is look at how did this occur, and what is actually happening now, and what can we do about it? And that, I think, needs to be able to understand it and prepare properly. That requires a mix of science and history and foresight. Most of the cyberneticians and the people that I deal with tend to focus on the science or the application to contemporary issues. But it's very difficult to understand how the Anthropocene emerged if you don't combine it with that science with also history, and then looking forward to the future and extrapolating what's likely to be occurring if we don't make changes in the way we've been operating up until now, or if we make changes in certain ways, and what kind of consequences will come as a result of our actions. So I've been conducting a research project for the last 4 or 5 years pretty intensively that builds on my 50 years in the field as a cybernetician and a system scientist and an historian. And I think there are profoundly emergent characteristics for the species as a whole that started becoming really evident about 500 years ago. So I actually think that it's useful to think about human beings, not just as Homo sapiens, which is the traditional term established by the biologists, but also primarily to think about what we've evolved into what I would call Homo Cyberneticus. And I don't mean by that some post-human kind of capability. I mean to emphasize the most important characteristic of human beings, which is not that we're so smart in our brain, but it's our ability to do things, and not only to engage in action for ourselves, but also to engage in actions that affect and cause other things to happen outside our individual selves, our social selves, etc. So I think this has led over the last 500 years or so to a major meta change in the relationship between people and the planet. And this is evident not only in our basic relationships, but how we interact. And it's in reflecting an increasingly active role by human beings in having impacts beyond our species, beyond our immediate environment, and affecting the planet as a whole. So the meta cause behind this change, as far as I'm concerned, has been an exponential transformation in human cyberneticity. And human cyberneticity reflects fundamentally the multidimensional nature of human agency and autonomy and identity. In other words, it reflects our abilities to do things. And we take it for granted. Human beings tend to, I believe, view our cybernetic capabilities in the same way that fish might view water. We just take it for granted. It's there. We don't have to think very much about it. And we generally, might look at certain interactions, but we don't look at the fundamental basis, which is that this is a very unique kind of capability. So I want to then talk also for a moment about the nature of cybernetics, and I'm explicitly including in here cybernetics as well as system science, or what can be easily called systemics, just for the sake of alliteration and clarity. But there's lots of different perceptions about cybernetics, and that's understandable because the origins of the field 60 plus years ago came out of engineering and applying that to looking at human systems. But if you talk to anybody, whether it be lay people or experts in lots of different fields, their perception of cybernetics, I found, it tends to focus on technology, overwhelmingly on technology, but especially human-machine interfaces, computers, now AI, robotics, automated factories, control theory, a lot of emphasis on information as compared to matter energy. There's also some recognition that cybernetics is about feedback systems, especially nonlinear feedback systems and negative feedback systems to help correct behaviors. I would underscore that cybernetics is first and foremost and most fundamentally about purposeful systems, about the ability of some systems to behave in such a way that they can focus on goals and achieve those goals and engage in activities that allow them to be successful in achieving those goals, and that is the most significant defining characteristic of cybernetics. I know that other people have different perceptions and that other people would define things differently, and so they focus on lots of different topics within the field, and that's understandable. I think people should be able to pursue what they're interested in looking at and emphasize the characteristics of their perspectives that are relevant to them and the work that they do. But I would argue very strongly that cybernetics' most important contribution is being able to understand the nature of purposeful behavior, and that as such, cybernetics is the scientific explanation of how agency and autonomy and other aspects of our behavior occur. And so therefore, that's where I start. And when I started in the field in the mid-70s, it was an interest in cybernetics, but also more broadly system sciences. So for me, the distinction that I would use for this talk and for everything else that I'm doing is that cybernetics is a universal science and praxis, that is both the understanding of what it is and how you apply it for purposeful phenomena. And that system science or systemics are the universal science of and praxis of for any phenomena. We can view anything in the known universe in terms of parts and wholes and relationships and counterintuitive behaviors in terms of complex systems and certainly emergent properties and a variety of other characteristics. Let me make a key point here. A lot of people would not agree with making a claim that it's a universal science, but I think people can apply it to anything they're interested in looking at in ways that go beyond just time and space. It's not just limited to us. I think these are generic capabilities. And so then when you take a look at combining the two, the question is, how do you use it? And one could argue, and it has often been argued within the cybernetics community over the years, especially on the practitioners, is that you can view the world as a black box, this world that we create, that we construct. And you can act, see what happens, take the feedback about the results of what your actions are, and then modify it. And we slowly build up, certainly at the individual level, starting with our neurophysiology, and then moving on to individual and then groups, et cetera. We know how to interact with this broader world. But the system sciences and systemics provide a more rigorous way of understanding and characterizing that broader world, so that we don't have to just always do it on an ad hoc, piecemeal, or reactive basis. We can be proactive, and it always helps to be informed. It's much better to deal with a gray box than a black box, and it's much better to deal with a clear box than a gray box. So for me to be able to try to think about cybernetics in the 21st century, especially moving forward, I think it's important to emphasize that we're always acting cybernetically with a small c, and we're trying to figure out how we make sense of this world in terms of, you know, a systemic view of it. And then as we build up our knowledge and our experience, we can interact with it in more intentionally successful and practical ways. So it's the combination of the two. And one of the lessons that we'll learn of our behavior, especially over the last 500 years as a species, is that unrivaled or unregulated human purposeful behavior has caused, in some cases, many problems that are really, really serious, including the Anthropocene as a whole. So it's a combination of acting cybernetically, large A, large C, acting cybernetically, that is intentionally using the insights and the tools and the capabilities of cybernetics as a field to construct and interact with an increasingly complex world that goes beyond just what was existing when the species started, but what we've had a huge impact on terms of constructing, if we want to deal with the issues that are facing us in the 21st century. So for me, I would also take those two notions of cybernetics and acting with a greater knowledge and capability of the greater whole, the bigger picture. I also think it's extremely valuable to recognize this is not just a field or an ad hoc approach, but both of them are powerful integrative paradigms in the context and the way that Thomas Kuhn first brought attention to it, at least popularized the notion. So when I've talked to people and interact with people over the years, even people who are a lifetime involvement in the field as well, they tend to come from different perspectives. So for me, a paradigm includes at least 5 major components or aspects. One is epistemological. How do we construct knowledge? How do we know about the world? Ontological, which is what is the nature of the world and including ourselves, and what is that? Methodological, how do we go through and exercise in an intentional way, taking steps to get something done? Because you don't want to just go through and do an ad hoc piecemeal approach every time you're coming into a situation that you want to address. Axiological, which has to do with values, because one can use any kind of human knowledge, technologies, and approaches in both positive and negative ways. And we tend to take that for granted. I think we ought to be explicit. And then clearly the teleological aspect of what's going on. Paradigms aren't just a pair of glasses that we put on and then see the world in different ways. It's how we construct the world and how we're acting. And every time we're acting in some kind of intentional manner. It might be a reaction rather than a proactive approach, but it's still some level of intentional activity. So when I'm talking about cybernetics and systems, I am consciously recognizing and thinking about them as metadisciplinary paradigms with multiple aspects. And it's not just epistemological or ontological or methodological or axiological or teleological. It's a combination of those 5, and the question of how you then approach whatever issues you're trying to deal with. So as an example, there have been significant distinctions in the cybernetics field over the last 50 years between first order and second order cybernetics. I think there are some significant insights from both of those, and I think even making the distinction is insightful. But I also think people have carried it too far. It's originally, at least in my discussions with Heinz and others, was an historical distinction. The early stages of cybernetics was about computers and technology and the observed phenomena. And now, as we've learned more, starting in the 70s, that it's about the nature of applying those insights to the human domain, which I think is really important and more important than applying it to the technological domain. But it's also about recognizing it's about how observers create the observed and the relationship between observes and observations. But that's not the only contribution from cybernetics. And so therefore, when I'm using it for addressing concerns, I'm always thinking about it as some part of a very powerful integrative paradigm that can be used in lots of different ways. And we ought to be as clear as we possibly can how we're defining and which of those domains or those aspects of the paradigm are relevant to the topics that we're addressing at the time. So for me, I have found that it really is cybernetics in combined with systemics is sort of like a master key or a master password. It allows you to get into all kinds of diverse topics and diverse fields and deal with diverse groups of people because you have some coherent organizing capability that facilitates cross-fertilization across all these different topics, fields, groups, et cetera, and can then, through the cross-fertilization, promote more collaborative and more effective action that works not only for those of us who are trying to act, but also for the greater good and the larger portion of the world that we're dealing with. So in this sense, I see cybernetics and systems as certainly cross-disciplinary. I certainly think as transdisciplinary, but I also want to underscore, in my view, I do think it is a metadisciplinary paradigm because it can underlie and provide insights to anything we're interested in taking a look at or interested in doing. So let's talk for a moment about human cyberneticity, at least as I look at it. And I think it's evolved to the point that we have unprecedented capabilities and connections. So the key element for me is that people are able to engage in agency. They're actually able to do something. And related to agency, but not identical with it, is that there's also the ability to act in ways that are free from external or relatively free from external constraints. So it's agency is the ability to act. Autonomy is the freedom to act in the ways that systems feel like doing so. And in the case of human beings, because of this combination of agency and increased autonomy over the millennia since the species started evolving from the rest of the primates, it's also enabled us to take an awful lot of interest in our own identity. That is, not just do we have agency and we have freedom and autonomy, but then that affects our identity, who we see ourselves as, how we like to have others see us, how we see other people. So there's a complex relationship between agency and autonomy and identity that occurs in human beings that you don't really see to the same extent to any other kind of species, and certainly not in non-living systems. Agency, again, is the self-organizing capability to engage in effective actions, at least in terms of the best I can tell. Autonomy is this self-organizing capability that allows such systems, and in this case, primarily humans, to engage in independent actions. So it doesn't mean we're completely independent from or separated from our contexts or our environments, but it means we can take actions that are independent of specific constraints, specific limits, et cetera. So the importance of cyberneticity for me is this self-organizing capability that any system has if they're a cybernetic system, but especially human cyberneticity, to transcend constraints. If you put it for me, I think the best known or the best way of thinking about it is to view the known universe, everything we know about the known universe, nearly 14, 15 billion years old, continue to expand. It's huge, all kinds of different kind of phenomena, but everywhere in the universe, the indications are that all the phenomena follow basic fundamental, what we call physical laws, except for this little tiny planet on the outpost of a small star called Sol, sort of on the far out reaches of the Dagobah system, if you want to think about it, where there's been life. We don't have any evidence of life anyplace else in the universe. There may well be life elsewhere. There may well be statistically evidence that there'll be probability of life elsewhere. But to the best extent of what we know right now, everything in the known universe is governed by physical laws, except on planet Earth, where some phenomena, biological phenomena, can transcend some of those physical constraints, and notably the second law of thermodynamics and energy, so that you then begin to have capabilities that are not evident elsewhere. And in the case of human beings in particular, but also some animals, you have significant increases in individual agency and autonomy at the biological level. If you're able to move to go get food, then it enhances your ability to develop and give access to the energy that allows you to do things. And human beings have more of that primates have more of that capability than others, and human beings have more of that than any other primate. So we have this core biological cyberneticity. And the reason it's, again, so important is this ability to engage in agency and autonomy is the most significant and the most anomalous phenomenon in the known universe, given current knowledge, at least in my view. And what's been happening, if you take a look at human history over the last, and it could be the last 200,000 years, it could be the last 10,000 years, what you see is fundamentally a glorified hockey stick. Everything's relatively flat compared to vantage point from here. You have all kinds of developments and activities, and you've got ancient Rome, and you got ancient Greece, and you got China, and you got the Aztecs, and different places around the planet. But fundamentally, over the last 200,000 years, over the last 10,000 years, from the vantage point of 2024, it's relatively flat. And then all of a sudden, about 200 years ago, you start seeing this huge exponential increase in terms of prosperity, in terms of population, in terms of capability. And the origins of that, I think, really started coming together about 500 years ago. So this expanding cyberneticity, highly self-organizing, we're able to engage in actions and do things for ourselves. But in humanity's case, what distinguishes it from other kinds of cybernetic systems on the planet is we also have increasingly sophisticated capabilities to organize other aspects of our world outside of our own activities. And this tends to take place, when we cluster it, you can define it in lots of different ways, but in terms of our social capabilities, because groups of people can do more than any individual by themselves if they're organized properly or in ways that are effective. But it's also technological in the ability to create tools, techniques, and other kinds of systems that allow us to enhance our cyberneticity. And then neurological, which has to do with the ideas, because knowledge is really, really important. So there's this basic biological cyberneticity, and then we enhance it significantly through the combination of social, technological, and neurological capabilities, the sociosphere, the technosphere, the noosphere, in addition to the biosphere. And if you're surfing around the galaxy and you're surfing around the universe as a whole, this is an incredibly significant and very, very rare or anomalous phenomenon. And I think that is the most important defining characteristic of Homo sapiens and what I would argue is now Homo Cyberneticus, and that we ought to really, really zero in on that, because cybernetics provides a rigorous way to understand that capability, but also then to use it more effectively and intentionally to build a better world for ourselves and others. So a quick overview. I know this is going to be a quick and dirty picture from an historian standpoint. But in creating the Anthropocene, what I witnessed, especially in the last 500 years or so, is unprecedented growth and development. And so I think if we're going to try to figure out how to apply and use cybernetic and systemic insights and capabilities to improve the condition in the 21st century, we have to start with understanding how it became what it is. It didn't just appear out of nowhere. It didn't appear quickly and easily. It has taken a long time to develop. But these transformational changes started in Western Europe. There are obviously connections other places, and I'm not arguing here for an inherent superiority of the Western cultural approach. I'm just saying, taking a look at historically, you have these significant transformational changes that largely were triggered by a particular set of conditions coming together in Western Europe. So it's not just Europe, it's Western Europe. And it's not organized countries. It's a collection of family duchies that are all jockeying for position and trying to get resources and goods, and especially from China and the Far East, and trying to improve what they were doing. And so in Western Europe, around 500 years ago, right after the discovery of the Western Hemisphere, you have a combination of cultural capabilities with more of an emphasis on individual approaches, largely coming out of the emergence of Protestantism vis-a-vis Roman Catholicism. You have a significant increase in knowledge, initially in the scientific revolution, well, starting actually with the Renaissance, but then the scientific revolution, and then the scientific revolution applying it to human domains and the Enlightenment, and a whole series of then profound, rapid technological changes in multiple dimensions of human activity. And this expansion was a step function change. If you, again, look at anything before that's happened anywhere on the planet, with respect to non-human and then human activity and the results, this is profoundly different. Everything is some kind of version of a organized hockey stick. It's also self-reinforcing and evolving cyberneticity. So the more capable we became, the more innovative we became, which then led to greater capabilities, but then led to more innovation, which then, and you have these escalating effects. And so the results of the last 500 years compared to the previous, 9,500 years, if you want to do it for roughly 10,000 years since the beginning of the agricultural revolution, there's been significant increases in connecting human beings, in understanding both ourselves and the world, on liberating human beings and fostering increasing levels of individual freedom and prospering. The level and prosperity that we've had in all aspects of human existence, not everywhere on the planet for everybody. Obviously, some people are significantly better off than others. But if you take a look at the raw data, never have so many people had it so good in the history of the species. And the upsurge is very clearly escalating and rippling out. This didn't happen overnight, and at least I think you can identify 5 major transformational phases, at least historically. And the first one was, and this is all sort of a modernization. You could talk about a modernizing world, or this is what has led to the ability to create the Anthropocene. But the first 300 years, you have the origin, exploration, moving around, trade, but you have the increase in the scientific revolutions. Then 1800 to 1870, early industrial revolutions, and started in England, and then it's moved to the continent. 1870 to 1945, you had fundamentally energy revolutions. Being able to use, especially the development of fossil fuels, provided more mobile and cheaper and more reliable sources of energy. Starting in 1945, which partly gave birth to cybernetics and the system sciences, you have now information revolutions through 1990. And then since 1990, we're in a new phase. You can call it the globalization revolution. There may be better terms, but those work for now, because I do think that the combination of the end of the Cold War and the emergence of the World Wide Web led to significant unleashing of human interactions, connectivity, trade, ideas, migrations, technologies that have produced where we are now in the 21st century. And it's that historical development has been instrumental in now creating what can be called the Anthropocene, and which many people are beginning to call the Anthropocene. So we have this new world. It's not brand new, like it ended on Sunday and we started a new world on Monday, but it's been relatively unprecedented in terms of the speed at which it's occurred. And we have these unprecedented dilemmas and dangers that are facing the species and facing the planet. And I think it's useful to divide them into 2 different kinds of points that I'd like to make here. The first one is there's a whole bunch of critical challenges. And right now we have this global crisis, and we think about it as a tipping point, but that tipping point has been the result of the combination of population times prosperity. If we didn't have as many people, but we're living at the same level of prosperity, we wouldn't have anywhere near the same impact on the external world, that is the rest of the planet, as we're having. If we had the same population, but significantly less levels of prosperity, we wouldn't have the same impact. It's the combination of dramatic increases in population, which come a result of improved conditions, including healthcare, et cetera, combined with the prosperity that generates. So there's a positive feedback loop between population and prosperity, and leads to an exponentially increase in terms of the impact that it's having on the planet. You can talk about lots of different kinds of challenges. I think it's useful to try to make sense of it, especially when you're explaining to people who say, look at you and say, what do you mean the Anthropocene? What are you talking about? And so there's planet-centric challenges that would include climate change, but also things like pandemics and species extinction and declining resources, and a host of others. These are just sort of the tip of the iceberg, but it's not just climate, and it's not just pandemics, and it's not just. And then there are people-centric challenges that are more focused on humanity, our issues as versus the planetary issues. And that has to do with freedom and justice and conflicts and health and a variety of those kinds of concerns. And here's a key point that I'll get into in the latter part of the talk, is that it's not just that we have planet-centric challenges and people-centric challenges, but it's the intersection of many of those. So climate exacerbates an awful lot of the people-centric challenges, but our ability to deal with climate, for example, or pandemics and other planet-centric challenges are significantly affected in an adverse way by conflicts and freedoms and concerns about justice and et cetera. So the critical factors in all of this have been a combination of our knowledge and our technology that have led to critical increases in terms of amplifying and accelerating the factors that are causing these challenges. And so I think it's extremely helpful to take a cybernetic look at it and have the insights and zero in on what are the characteristics of our enhanced ability to engage in purposeful activity and to exercise agency and autonomy and the role of identity and all of that in terms of creating these characteristics of the Anthropocene, these challenges. So you have the challenges, but I also think it's important to emphasize that there are a number of corrosive conditions. So the dominating characteristic of the Anthropocene is that it's been caused by a cumulative series of runaway positive feedback processes. Gregory Bateson highlighted this in some of his work in the late 60s, but most people haven't paid attention to it as much, is that if we have these increased cybernetic capabilities individually and as a species and as a whole, and all the different manifestations, whether it be at the individual level or the group level or the community level or the organization or the nation state, they're all engaged in agency. And if we keep pursuing our own individual or systemic goals without paying close attention to the impacts that it has on our broader context, we have problems. And so where we've gotten right now is that you have, in essence, the result of lots of the wisdom of the masses, the wisdom of the market, if you're just looking at it in economic terms, that have created the Anthropocene. And now we're beginning to have enough data to show, whoa, these conditions are serious. Second, we're in particular concern, we have particular problems they're facing in terms of viability. And third, we're responsible. So we better start getting our act together and figuring out what to do about it. So there's two paradoxes that I think characterize the Anthropocene that are worth really focusing on. And one I've titled the purpose paradox, which is this ability, the relationship between human autonomy and human authority. And you see it playing out, for example, in the political realm significantly in the United States now and in other places around the planet, where you have increasing autonomy by different kinds of individuals and social systems and entities. And then you have increasing activities by other people who are trying to dampen that autonomy. So one of the lessons from the law of requisite variety is that if you want to deal with any kind of complex system, you have to have at least as much capabilities or more capabilities than whatever you're trying to manage or control. And in this case, that leads to two fundamental types of choices or sets of choices strategically. One is you can choose to amplify your own capabilities so that you can deal with the external variety, or you can choose to dampen the variety of the external conditions so that you don't have to change and worry about doing too much yourself. And so what happens is you have these choices, And people have generally found it's easier to try to dampen somebody else's ability to act and do ways rather than change their abilities to adjust to the changing conditions. So there's this paradox, this tension between human autonomy and human authority, what we find appropriate in terms of how that plays out. The other progress is the progress paradox. And it's this interplay between human prosperity, significant growth in development and human prosperity, but also significant growth in adversity. So as we start having increasingly prosperous conditions as a result of our increasing cybernetic capabilities in a finite world, you start running into all kinds of adversity in terms of, well, who gets what and how do we do that? So the overall result of these paradoxes and is characteristic of the Anthropocene is this a growing human footprint that's threatening the viability of planet Earth. And for years, I've been talking about it because I thought Kenneth Boulding and Buckminster Fuller had a really good spaceship Earth, because that highlights the fact that we're floating through space, we're doing things, and we've got to make sure planet Earth is capable of sustaining us, or we're in deep trouble. But I actually think that's a misnomer. A better analogy or metaphor is to think about it as Oasis Earth. I don't remember where I read that recently, but the reason for that is because if you think about it as spaceship Earth, that sort of raises in most people's minds this notion, well, we created it, it's a technology, we can fix it. It's just like any other machine. We can take care of it pretty quickly. But if you realize Earth is really an oasis, otherwise destitute, at least in terms of human conditions, part of the galaxy, part of the universe as a whole, I think that highlights the vulnerabilities even more significantly. And I've always chuckled when I hear people talking about, boy, we ought to think about how we just setting up colonies on Mars or setting up colonies on the moons, and we can't figure out how to live in Antarctica. And Antarctica is significantly easier for human beings to live in than any place that doesn't have any form of natural atmosphere. So if we're taking a look at understanding the Anthropocene, there are these sets of unprecedented dilemmas and unprecedented dangers, and we ought to understand that very clearly. Now the question is, what can we do about it? And I think there's unprecedented priorities and unprecedented urgencies. In other words, we have to be able to, we can't just do everything. So we have to figure out what's most important in terms of establishing priorities. And second of all, we don't have unlimited time. Some of these issues that we're dealing with are very urgent. We have to pay attention to them soon. One key point, we live in a complicated global world. There are lots of growing interconnections in terms of the breadth and the intensity and the velocity and the impacts of these interconnections. Some people talk about it as a VUCA world, which emphasizes the volatility and the uncertainty and the complexity and the ambiguity of the conditions. But what's clear is we have changing realities and we have changing risks. So if we keep acting in the way that we've been doing up until now, then we're going to keep getting what we've been getting. That's not very healthy. It's called the insanity trap. So the question is, given these changing realities and the changing risks, what should be done? And then as we look at that and bring it back into the human domain, we have changing responsibilities and changing rules about what can be done. Human beings have a responsibility not just to maximize our own self-interest. This is an axiological perspective, for example, but to act in ways that are good for us and good for others, because it's also good for our enlightened self-interest. So the rules about how to act in a changing world, we thought a lot of those have been resolved. The end of the Cold War, life's going to get inherently better because we didn't have to focus on doom and gloom. And yet, in fact, it's unleashed a whole bunch of social and other kinds of interactions and conflict that makes it difficult to get anybody to agree on what should be done. So not only is it a complicated global world, but it's a vulnerable global world. And one of the things I've observed about human beings is that we're part smart, but we're whole stupid. That is, we have really good understandings of portions of things, but it's very difficult to look at and understand the bigger picture. So this creates tragedies of the commons. and individual human systems, whether it be at the biological level or the social level or the nation state, et cetera, we end up creating tragedies of the commons because we act in our own self-interest, but we don't understand the bigger picture and the consequences of that. And these tragedies of the commons, and there's more than one, it's not just a tragedy of the common, they're generating these interactive insanity traps where we keep doing what we've been doing, but we expect different results. And in fact, we often expect better results, when in fact, if we keep acting the way we've been acting, we're going to keep getting what we've been getting or worse. So some of the issues that we want to pay attention to, and cybernetics, at least for me, provides a really powerful way of focusing attention on this, is that these evolving rules is this historically through human history is the rules were imposing one's will on others. It was the law of the jungle, and then we started having some order, and then we started having governments, usually powerful people at the top. Then it's unleashed the more democratic approaches and the power of the markets, et cetera. But historically, it's been a transition and improvement from the rules basically being about imposed activities and how you interact with each other, which is based on power, into more negotiated, which is based on rights. That individual systems at whatever level have the ability and have the right to interact and to the extent of their capabilities and their freedoms, as long as it doesn't adversely affect the freedoms and the rights and the liberty of other cybernetic systems to engage in their appropriate activities. So from a cybernetic and systemic perspective, the key imperative, as far as I'm concerned, is how do you balance these relationships, the ability of power and the rights of people to act in ways that are, in their own self-interest, balance that in context of managing the greater good. Because so far, we're beginning to realize we're running out of space, we're running out of time, we're running out of resources. So taking those three, a quick overview, I know it's really quick and it wasn't as quick as I would have liked, but those are the characteristics. We're now dealing, if we want to try to build a better global world, we're dealing with a whole set of wicked messes. And I mean that consciously. It's not just wicked problems, which are relatively well-defined and can be resolved and solved. But like Russ Akoff said, that there are messes, not just problems, they're not well-defined, and we can't just solve them, we have to manage them. So we got wicked messes that we're dealing with all over the planet, and the improvements are very difficult to secure, especially when you can't even get people to agree on what's important, much less what we should do about it, and two, how does that affect us and our rice bowl? So critical characteristics in general, just go through these quickly, but these are the kinds of things that give you some sense of what's happening. You got multiple factors, you got multiple stakeholders, you have multiple interests. So it's not going to be easy to even identify what we want to pay attention to. Then you got multiple causalities and multiple emergent properties and multiple values, in terms of what people think are significant and what should be done. And then you get at the heart of the cybernetic activities that you have these multiple goals and multiple possibilities in terms of strategies for achieving those goals. And you have increasingly multiple capabilities for being able to act in effective ways to achieve goals. And then you start running into multiple leverage points, because you always want to look for leverage, and multiple consequences and multiple results. So it's really, really difficult for most people to get a sense of how conditions in the 21st century, and if we want to build a better global world, have changed so profoundly in the age of the Anthropocene compared to previous eras in human history, because there's just a whole lot of complexities there, of which these just this quick rundown of types of critical characteristics. And what I'd like to do is sort of close with here is an example of when all this stuff comes together. So recently, we went through the first major pandemic in 100 years with the COVID pandemic. And pandemics in general are at the interface of the planet-centric and the people-centric issues. So I'm actually more concerned about, and have been more concerned about, the adverse impact of pandemics than I have been about climate change, although climate change obviously affects all of that. But this is where it comes together, because the pandemics are not caused by human beings doing something to themselves, but they're generated by what's going on at the planetary level. And it goes around, it's not limited to certain parts of it. And the reason pandemics are significant is because they're historically more lethal than all the armed conflicts. If you take a look in the last 100 years, and much worse in previous eras, we spend an awful lot of money and an awful lot of attention worrying about how people interact with each other. And we have, for example, a Pentagon and a military complex in the United States that's set up to deal with these kinds of human conflicts. We don't have anything remotely comparable in terms of having a Pentagon that's effectively set up to deal with pandemics. Now, they don't come along as often, and we have less control over them, but they're significantly more lethal. So the reason I bring this up is we're trying to deal with this. You can't just ignore it because it's planetary sourced. It's not just a result of human activities. And if you take a look at the differences between the way China and the United States dealt with the pandemic, it highlights the different kinds of possibilities when you start trying to apply your cybernetic knowledge and capabilities in the context of autonomy and agency and identity. So in China, they significantly curtailed all of their civil liberties early on. And that significantly limited the spread, and it led to an early recovery. Now, there's all kinds of questions about the data coming out of the Chinese government about how many deaths there actually were and what the percentages were. But it's very clear that, as an example, compared to the United States, where you have two large countries, they had at best, I mean, worst, they had about 1/3 the level of fatality per million people. In the United States, you don't have significant limits on civil liberties, and especially because of what had happened politically and the rise of Trump and the others, you have the anti-vaxxers and people for political reasons saying, no, I'm not going to get a vaccine, or no, I'm not going to wear a mask. And you can't just curtail those kinds of civil liberties in the United States without having all kinds of major revolutionary consequences. But that led to a much more extensive spread, which led to a much lengthier recovery for the country as a whole than in China. So the reason I highlight this is that when it comes to interfaces between planet-centric and people-centric issues, you're not going to have the same latitude. It's much more complicated than if it was just purely a people-centric issue. You don't have to worry about planet. Then you can figure out how to put limits on that work within the appropriate structure and the rules regarding civil liberties and freedom and everything else. But Mother Earth doesn't pay attention to that stuff. And so therefore, I don't have the answer for it. And I'm not arguing that we should adopt the approach that China did and curtail all the civil liberties, but nor am I saying that we should just always allow the civil liberties and live with the consequences. If the COVID virus had the lethality of Ebola and the transmissibility of measles, we would have lost half the population of the world in about 6 months. That's something you got to pay attention to. So as an example, as we're trying to figure out how to build a better world and dealing with these wicked messes, not only are the planetary issues and challenges complicated and the people-centric issues complicated, but the interface between them is even more complicated. And we have to figure out how to address that, because I think that's going to be more of the norm than the exception moving forward. So some final comments with respecting building a better global world. And in this case, I want to emphasize the importance of acting cybernetically and acting systemically. And I'm consciously making the distinction that based upon a recognition that we already act cybernetically and systemically, little a, little c, lowercase, because that's who we are. But for me, I'm talking acting cybernetically, uppercase A, uppercase C, uppercase S. That is, how do we consciously use our expertise as cyberneticians and system scientists? How do we use this paradigm to be able to move forward? So success in dealing with the kinds of issues that are increasingly characteristic of the Anthropocene, If we want to build a better global world, it's going to require acting more strategically, that is, looking at the bigger picture, more integratively, cutting across lots of different kinds of interests and areas of expertise and issues that interact and overlap with each other, and especially working collaboratively. In fact, I am less concerned about the planetary issues than I am the people-centric issues, because if we don't address and improve our ability to address the people-centric issues, we have no way of getting at working effectively together to address the planetary kinds of concerns. So I find it really, really helpful to use cybernetics and systemics and the expertise that we have as a meta paradigm, combined with substantive expertise and combined with local values and local interests. It's not just swooping in as experts and saying we're going to solve the problems. But I would emphasize in closing that there's two basic options that the law of requisite variety clarifies, as I mentioned earlier. And one option is that if you want to deal with increasing complexity and challenges, you increase your own capabilities. And the other option too is, and this is generally a set of options, is you dampen those external capabilities. So in the first one, we want to amplify our own capabilities. We want to amplify democracy and promote diversity and freedom and the greater good. But we can also take cybernetics and systems and use it to dampen. And so in that case, you're going to end up promoting autocracy and tribalism and oppression and selfish interests. And you see that playing out in multiple dimensions, politically, economically, socially, healthcare, everything that's going on around the planet in the human dimension is some tension between these ways of handling how you deal with the ability to and the right to engage in independent, autonomous kinds of behaviors in order to exercise your agency that reflect the importance of our identities, but do so in ways that don't adversely compromise the ability of other human cybernetic systems to exercise their freedom and individualism, et cetera. So for me, the value of cybernetics and systems for the 21st century is how we address these kinds of concerns. And closing note, I'd emphasize the importance of leadership. A lot of people think leadership only has to do with authoritarian approaches or top-down approaches. I think the best definition that I learned when I was a Kellogg Fellow was that the best definition of leadership is the ability to mobilize people and resources in pursuit of shared goals. And it can be done in a directive way that promotes followership, or it can be done in a collaborative way that promotes partnership. But the whole role and the value of leadership in general is that it helps us amplify and focus and apply our collective human cyberneticity, or our capabilities to act in ways that can have a significant impact on the world we're living in. So there's no way to move on dealing with the issues to build a better global world in a world that is fundamentally characterized by the Anthropocene, unless we have more effective cybernetic and systemic approaches to leadership. Leadership really matters. It amplifies, it focuses, it will be the critical variable. So if we're able to exercise it and figure out how to do it, and again, I'm not favoring top-down directive authoritarian leadership. I'm focusing on collaborative, systemic, et cetera. The value of leadership is that it increases the likelihood of effective, responsible, and timely action. And that, to me, is what the essence of cybernetics is about, why I think it's so valuable. And a lot of the other topics that are being addressed by other speakers in this series and other parts in other fields, they're all important. But to me, this is the essence of why cybernetics and systems is really powerful, and how it can help us deal with the world we are creating in the 21st century. So I'll close with one final point. I had a colleague when I was doing a lot of work on global citizenship in Salzburg who shared an African proverb with me, which said that when the watering hole dries up, the animals look at each other differently. And that's what's going on right now in the Anthropocene. The watering hole is literally and figuratively drying up, and we're all starting to look at each other differently. And if we don't figure out how to work together more effectively at the people level, but also at the level of the broader system for the planet as a whole, we're going to be really deep trouble. So that's my contribution. Hope this has made some sense, and I'd be happy to hear from people if any of you have something you'd like to discuss. So thank you.